Welcome, everyone. Hello, everyone. I hope that little Pitbull motivational intro was enough to get your blood pumping. Wow, we have 280 people and counting, plus more on Facebook Live. Welcome, welcome. I'm Marc Ruben. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a partner at M&R, which is a group of about 130 organizers, communicators, fundraisers, and campaigners who unleash the power of people to do good. We are co-hosting this roundtable with our amazing friends from Repower, which you'll hear more about later. And I want to thank them along with the authors of the Hold the Line Guide for making this possible. Just before we begin, a bit of digital housekeeping. For security reasons, we've disabled the unmute and video functions on this call, so don't worry about embarrassing yourself. And that means the main way we'll be in conversation with all of you is in the Zoom chat and the Facebook Live comments. We set aside some time for QA with our panelists, so please pop questions into the chat or the Facebook comments as they come up, and we'll get to as many as we can. There are a lot of us right now, so feel free to answer each other's questions in the chat. If you read the Hold the Line Guide, you know that's we're all part of this. And if you're on Zoom, please be sure to chat all panelists and attendees so everyone can see. And if you wouldn't mind letting folks know your name and where you're from if you're putting a question in the chat. So I'd now like to introduce our amazing moderator and panelists for today's call. Wing, do you want to start?
Yes, thanks, Marc. My name is Wing Doan, pronouns are she, her. I'm the Managing Director of Program and Partnerships at Repower. And I'll pass it to Kifah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kifah Shah. My pronouns are she, her. I'm from Empower Change and a co-author of the Hold the Line Guide.
Hey, everyone. My name's Merriman. I'm speaking in my independent and personal capacity today. I am a co-author of the Hold the Line Guide, and my work focuses on civil resistance movements around the world that are fighting for human rights and democracy.
Hey everyone, I'm Ankur, Asthana. I use he, him, and I work with M&R, and I'm also a co-author of the guide.
Hey everyone, my name is Marium. Pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am also with M&R and a co-author of the guide, and I'm going to pass it to Jamarr.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jamarr Brown. I use he, him pronouns. I serve as the Director of Electoral Programs at Repower. I'm proud to be on this amazing panel today.
Wonderful. We are truly lucky to have these folks with us today. They've all thought a lot about this work and what we might face in the next few months, as many of us have. And we have a lot to cover, so we're going to dive right in. We're going to start with a quick presentation of what's in the Hold the Line Guide and some of the main contested election scenarios that we might face. Then we'll have our panel discussion, followed by a brief Q&A. Then I'll come back at the end to share some tools that we've put together to drive conversations within nonprofits about how to prepare organizations for a contested election. I do want to acknowledge that this topic, especially after last night's debate, can be pretty overwhelming. And if you need a break, please feel free to take it. We'll be sharing the recording afterwards, so you can always come back to this. And if folks wouldn't mind just sharing a word or phrase right now in the chat or the Facebook comments about how you're feeling about today's topic, we can get a bit of a temperature check as we gather. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the co-authors to share more about the origin of the guide, the model of change that it puts forth, and 3 of the top line scenarios that we should be prepared for.
Hey everyone, so I will start it off. Again, my name is Marium. I'm a digital organizer with M&R and a co-author of the Hold the Line Guide. So as Marc said, my co-authors and I are going to share a quick overview of the model of change and like what the guide is rooted in, nonviolent civil resistance, as well as just the 3 scenarios that we talk about, just to give everyone a quick overview of the top line things to look for during this election season. So Before we go into that, though, I did want to share a little bit about how this guide came together. The four of us, Kifah, Hardy, Ankur, and myself, convened in June to essentially just think of a resource that we could create to stop what we saw was a huge threat to our democracy. I believe all four of us agree that democracy in the United States has not necessarily worked for everyone throughout history and has not been perfect. But the threat we're seeing in November, a president and coalition refusing to honor and willing to subvert election results, is a threat that would take the United States into a whole nother realm of corruption. The tipping point for a lot of us was during the George Floyd protests, when we saw Trump threaten to invoke the Insurrection Act and saw him abuse his power. Once again, when he ordered the military and local law enforcement to attack peaceful civilians in DC. That was a red flag. And we all knew, we've been seeing these red flags pop up over the years, since the beginning of this year, since the past 3 years. And last night, we all saw Trump do it again, and he would not commit to accepting election results, and instead went on to talk about all the ways the elections would be quote unquote fraudulent. So it's very clear that an authoritarian takeover is very possible here in the US, and that is why we created this guide. We knew both from research and experience organizing that a concerted, united, and widespread movement is what will stop Trump and his allies from cheating their way to another 4 years. So that's why the guide is essentially drafted for everyday people. That was our intent, to make it accessible to people on the ground, and just to give people who have the energy to do something, to give them a roadmap. So even though this is drafted for individual use, I do think that the theory of change and even the steps are actually very applicable to nonviolence and other organizations that you all are a part of. The steps that we outline and the scenarios are great tools for organizational planning as you all start to think about your own GOTV efforts, end of year fundraising, and other programming. We all know nonprofits have the influence and the people power to really set the tone and lead in this moment. And so we hope that today we can have that conversation that both inspires everyone here and motivates you all to take really bold action in your own spheres of influence. So I'm gonna hand it off to Hardy now, who's going to dig a little bit deeper into our model of change and talk more about nonviolent civil resistance.
Thanks, Marium. So nonviolent civil resistance, our model of change is based on lessons learned from movements around the world that use tactics such as strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, non-cooperation, and many other large and small nonviolent actions to challenge authoritarian rule and to win rights, freedom, and justice. And the reason civil resistance works, the reason it's powerful, is because power holders ultimately depend on the obedience and often the passivity of significant portions of a population that they attempt to rule. And that means that when people shift their behavior and obedience patterns, when they withdraw their consent and stop cooperating in more strategic and targeted ways, they can actually shift the balance of power in society. They can exert enormous social and economic and political pressure. So that sounds sort of theoretical and abstract, but in fact, it's quite practical and has worked in many, many parts of the world, from Serbia to Sudan to certainly throughout US history. In fact, over the last 10 years, one of the most recurring research findings in the field of civil resistance has been that movements engaging in these kinds of nonviolent tactics are some of the strongest challenges to authoritarianism in the world. And they are also some of the strongest drivers of democratic change in the world. I would argue the single strongest way of advancing democracy. And we can see this in US history. I mean, when we look at how women's rights to vote were recognized through nonviolent struggle, when we look at how labor rights have been advanced, civil rights, the rights of marginalized communities and populations, advances in environmental protection and justice. In many, many other causes, people have used these kinds of repertoires of tactics to advance their goals. And in the US, frequently people have used civil resistance alongside institutional means of change, like elections and lawsuits. And so, what we've seen is, in fact, when you use civil resistance and engage in institutions, you actually can make those institutions stronger where they've been weakened and actually get them to start to live up to their democratic ideals. So, drawing from this and hold the line, we actually start, what can you do to help? The first thing we say is drawn straight out of just civic engagement. Vote, register to vote and vote. Make sure you can help others get out the vote. And if you can, volunteer to be a poll worker. And then if you want to go further, we have the bulk of the guide is about how you can set up your own election protection groups in your own communities, a 4-step process for that. And then how to start planning civil resistance actions in your community if or when election results are subverted. So that's a little bit about the model of change, and I'm going to pass to Ankur.
Thanks, Hardy. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what the timeline and scenarios look like where this model of change can be applied. And one way that we can think about the timeline after Election Day is in 2 phases of about 5 weeks each. So the first phase really goes from Election Day on November 3rd until December 14th. And this phase is really about local and state governments. This is when local and state election officials are going to be responsible for making sure that all the ballots are counted properly. And at the end of this period, on December 14th, each state's board of electors, who makes up our Electoral College, are supposed to meet and cast their official votes for the president and vice president. And the governor of each state is then responsible for sending certificates of the results to Congress. So that's kind of the behind the scenes of what happens between Election Day and in the first phase. And then the second 5 weeks are really about the federal government certifying the results. And so during this time, Congress is responsible for counting and certifying the vote tallies from all the states by January 6th. And this is also potentially the time where the federal government would have to step in if there are issues with the state certificates or with vote counts. So we can go to the next slide. And keeping these 2 phases in mind, there are 3 scenarios that potentially could unfold during a contested election that we talk about in our guide. And these scenarios are not mutually exclusive. There are other scenarios that could play out as well, but our hope in sharing these is that they paint a picture of the kinds of things we need to be prepared for. And the one other thing I'll just say before diving into these is that we want to caution everyone to keep in mind that when you're reading about this stuff in the news or we're going through these scenarios, what Trump and his allies want is for us to feel demotivated and not turn out to vote. And so as Hardy was saying, it's really critical to make sure that we're doing everything we can between now and Election Day first to make sure we have a successful election to set us up to be able to respond if we face these scenarios. So scenario 1 is a contested election where the Election Day results are unclear and Trump declares victory anyway. And so this could happen because the race is close and there's no clear winner due to mail-in ballots still needing to be counted. And at this point, Trump and his allies could attempt to discredit the results by launching investigations into voter fraud. They could try to seek court orders in certain states to stop ballot counting early, or they could try to pressure state leadership to not certify the correct results on December 14th. You can go ahead to the next slide. And so in this scenario, nonprofits have a number of ways to act. Organizations can put out an impartial call for every vote to be counted and for the results to be respected. And the idea is that every ballot should be counted is something that really shouldn't be a partisan issue. It goes beyond political party, and everyone should be able to get behind this. Beyond that, obviously, depending on your organization's legal status, there's a range of things you can do, from challenging lies about voter fraud online to training supporters to protest peacefully to really supporting local groups. And that really depends on your strategy and what you're capable of doing. And we go into a lot more detail into that in the guide. We have an entire section about who the targets might be, how to plan the right tactics to help you and your supporters be able to put out a response. And with that, I'll pass it to Kifah, who can talk about the next scenario.
Thank you, Ankur. So the second scenario that we outline in the Hold the Line guide is that the election results will show significant irregularities or tampering, but Trump may still declare victory. We expect that what will follow is that there will be widespread misinformation campaigns by right-wing media or foreign entities. And some of the irregularities that we might see include delays in reporting ballot counting, and also that the numbers just won't add up. So one expectation that we also need to prepare for is that federal, local, and state actors might either interfere or also take no action when it comes to upholding transparent forms of investigation. Another part of this scenario that we have to think through is that people will and may respond with protest, and consequently we might see violence from police and military forces. Next slide. So now let's think about the opportunities that we can consider in this scenario. We'll really need to support and normalize nonviolent protests in every way that we can, and that includes training people on how to resist. We'll also need to place pressure on elected officials to support and conduct independent investigations, especially local and state officials in battleground states. We will also need to amplify Republicans who are calling for a fair and transparent process. And finally, we really do need to move forward working together, especially with organizations that have been doing the work, especially against voter suppression, like Fair Fight, Protect the Results, and Choose Democracy. Next slide. So the last scenario that we outline is that Trump may lose the election, but also refuses to leave office. In this scenario, we can expect that a lot of the tactics Ankur mentioned in scenario 1 might arise, and Trump, supportive media, or other actors might really drive forward a voter fraud narrative. And that means that in the initial hours or the days afterward, we might see a narrative like that really take hold. Which also means that, for the Biden campaign, you're going to have to prove negative, which means that voter fraud didn't actually happen. But we do have to think about the potential threat also of violence and from those particular entities that would allow Trump to double down on his law and order messaging. And, especially if people are going to take to protesting. Next slide. So what are the opportunities in this scenario? Some of the opportunities are similar to the ones that Ankur talked about in scenario 1, and we'll also need to think about a strong united front strategy where nonprofits publicly show support for transparent election processes. And it's worthwhile to mention again that upholding democracy is still a C3 act. It's not partisan, so don't worry. We'll also need to prepare to reprioritize. Right? So it might be that fundraising takes a backseat while we do urgent organizing and prepare for potentially a long fight. And again, here we will have to also amplify Republican voices calling for a peaceful transition, and also maybe lean into messaging like the sore loser. Next slide. So you'll be able to access all of these scenarios in the Hold the Line guide, but this is an overview of some of the ones that we just mentioned. So scenario 1 is that when the election results are unclear, but Trump declares victory anyway. Scenario 2 is when election results show significant irregularities or signs of tampering, but Trump declares victory anyway. And the third is that Trump loses the election, but refuses to leave office. So as Ankur mentioned, these are not scenarios that are mutually exclusive necessarily, and yes, there could be others, but these are the 3 that we saw coming up again and again in the research. And we do know that this is a lot to take in, and it might be stress-inducing, but the intention to present this is to understand what are the possible scenarios so that we can prepare and move forward with hope and togetherness and action. So I will now pass the mic to Wing, and we'll move into the panel portion.
Thank you so much, Kifah, and to all of the authors of the guide. You'll get to hear from them more in a moment. But like Kifah was saying, hearing all these scenarios, even though I've looked at them and read them many times, definitely can raise the blood pressure a little bit. So I would like to invite all of you to recenter ourselves together and take one deep collective breath together. So I'm going to lead us through a breathing exercise that helps reset the nervous system. And I'm going to ask you right now to find a comfortable seat. Sit with your back straight, shoulders back and down, and have your feet planted firmly on the ground. We're going to breathe to the count of 4, and we're going to inhale for 4, hold for 4, and exhale for 4. I'll provide the counting. Ready? Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. One more time. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. Whew. All right. Hope that helped to reset for everyone before we jump into our panel discussion. So again, my name is Doan. I am the Managing Director of Program and Partnerships at Repower, which was formerly known as Wellstone Action. We are a national training institution that provides training and strategic support to people across the progressive ecosystem, from community organizers to campaign managers to elected officials. Our vision is one of inclusive politics, a politics that represents all of us, especially and particularly those who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I want to remind everyone that as we're diving into the panel, if you have questions that come up, please put them in chat, and please do remember to chat to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see what you're writing. And we'll address all of your questions at the end. If you have a question for a specific panelist, please type their name first in all caps. So for instance, you would type Marc, or you would type Jamarr, and then write out the question. All right, so while it feels like we are living in unprecedented times, oh, before I start this question, panelists, would you come off camera, or on camera rather? All right, so while it feels like we're living in unprecedented times, and I think last night's debates were an example of that, we know that this has happened before. We know that voter suppression is not new, contested elections are not new, and there are lessons that we can draw on across time, across place, and across movements. So let's start there. What are the key lessons that we can learn from other places and times about how to respond to a contested election? And Hardy, since you had gone into this in your slides, why don't we start with you?
Great, thanks, Wing. So there's research on how civil resistance movements have stopped coup d'etat. And there's also significant research on how they've enforced contested elections. And I actually see them as fairly similar. A coup is basically an overthrow of a government. A stolen election is an overthrow of constitutional rule and democracy. And so a few lessons from that is that one is things tend to move really quickly, right? So what we would expect if there was a stolen election scenario or an attempt to subvert the results is for things to move quickly after November 3rd. And that means there's a need to respond very quickly in an organized way at the same time. So one way that these kind of sort of takeovers or usurpations happen is they create a sense of inevitability. People think, well, it's clearly not constitutional what's going on, or clearly there's something messed up here, but they'll probably get away with it. So what should I do? I lack confidence to go out. And there's actually research that looking at how people in governments behave when there are these kinds of takeovers. And the research that's most persuasive to me says what a lot of people are thinking within government informing how they act is not what's right or who do I want to win. It's actually what's safe and who do I think will win. There are always exceptions, but that's really important to keep in mind. People have a lot on the line working in government, and a lot of them will have a reason to want to play safe. So this means it's really important the minute something happens to be able to mobilize quickly and challenge it. People have to see it. People have to see, no, they may not get away with it. You have to build counter momentum to this sense of inevitability that they try to set into motion. And there's ways to do that don't even involve waiting till November. In October, we can start calling on our public officials to reaffirm their commitments to count every vote, to, if evidence of irregularities emerge, to investigate it impartially and quickly and remedy it, and to respect the results. We can consider calling on people in the police and military to reaffirm their oath to the Constitution, to re-recognize in public, clearly, that the First Amendment exists and that rights to protest are protected under the Constitution, and to protect people who are exercising those rights from others who may threaten them. These are things that can be done in October. They can already start to prevent a quick narrative from taking place after November. Now, to do that, I'll just share two other points. The first is that means we need to prepare now, right? There's not a lot of time, but there is enough time to start having conversations. Plenty of these kinds of events, people have emerged victorious without necessarily a ton of preparation. But we want to use the time that we have preciously, so it's really important to think, what are the assets that we have? How can we build trust in communities so that, and build that basic level of research that people may need about who their election officials are, so that they're ready to mobilize if needed afterwards. That's the kind of thing you want to do ahead of time, not after, because sometimes a delay of 3 to 5 days could be very significant. And the Hold the Line guide actually walks people through that really clearly. And the one other point I'd make is that nonviolent resistance is what authoritarians fear the most. They fear it much more than violence. Authoritarians try to provoke violence because they're really comfortable on that turf. So we would expect provocation if election results are going to be subverted. We would expect attempts to switch resistance to violence by those who are attempting to subvert the election. And it's really hard to hold that line of nonviolent discipline. But what the research shows is that when that line is held, the violence tends to backfire a lot against the perpetrators, and it actually tends to hurt them a lot more, their cause a lot more than it does the resistance. The nonviolent resistance is trying to restore democracy. This is also something that can be prepared for psychologically for people. And there are many different tactics people can do. Not all of them are going to put them at risk if they're not comfortable with potential risk.
Thank you so much for that, Hardy. I would like to open it up to see if another panelist has something to add, but before I do, I just want to highlight what you said about the sense of inevitability, that they are looking for that they know that that's going to be what keeps us silent, what keeps us from taking to the streets, what keeps us from taking action. And the antidote to that is to find solidarity, to mobilize, is to find hope, right, in each other. And so I really appreciate that point. Other panelists, did you have something to add to this question? Feel free to come off mute if you do. All right, if not, then we'll move on to our next question. So we know that certain communities are particularly susceptible to voter suppression, communities of color, students, people with disabilities, just to name a few. As we take actions to protect the election, how do we ensure that those who are most impacted are at the center? And for this question, I would like to start with Jamarr Brown.
Sure, and thank you, Wayne. And one of the things I think that's very important, especially about this election, the very thing that we have to know is democracy is on the line in this election. They will challenge every angle of democracy in this election. We have to make sure that folks are protected. That includes Black folks, that includes Indigenous people, that includes people of color, that includes women, that includes young people, people of different faiths, people of different ability levels. And so all of that has to be considered when we are talking about protecting in this election. And a lot of the work that we have to do is not just after November the 3rd. A lot of the work is what we're doing leading up to November 3rd. A lot of the things that Hardy talked about. What I want to add to what he talked about is how are we leveraging our relationships with elected officials and other actors to ensure that public safety is available for folks if they decide to participate in any actions. Because the very communities that we listed earlier are the very people who would be susceptible to any violent actions, any targets of violent actions, especially after the election. And so we've got to make sure that we do that. We also have to make sure that we're navigating election protection resources before the election, because it's very hard to show up for the very voters that we need to protect after the election if we don't show up for them in the election. And so that's why Repower has been working with several partners across the country that we've trained over 900 organizers across the country These are folks that are showing up to the polls, to work the polls. We also have to navigate that this is a COVID-19 period, right? And so now we have to have new and young workers at the polling locations to make sure that folks are protected. We also have to make sure that we're navigating a lot of different court rulings and things that are happening because there are signature challenges, there are ballot challenges, right? There's delays that a lot of counties and states don't even start counting the ballots until after the election is over, right? And so there's going to be some type of delay and a room for that. And so we've got to be building those relationships. We've got to be organizing those folks. We have to be educating folks. We have to do all of that work and train those folks. And so when the election does come, that when any of the scenarios that we were presented with earlier arise, that we are ready to pivot where we need to go to educate folks, to mobilize folks, but also we have to make sure we protect them, not just in the political system. We have to protect their bodies too, because we know that the other side will use that. You saw last night in the debate where the president literally told white supremacists in our country to stand by and that he will do anything in his power to protect them. And so we've got to make sure that we're navigating a lot of those relationships. We've got to make sure we have the organizing, and we're doing a lot more work in terms of helping organizations that we work with build digital infrastructure, because a lot of this work does have to happen online. It does have to happen virtually, right? Because we have to navigate protecting folks' vote, but also protecting their health, but also protecting their body. And so it's a lot of work that we have to do to make sure that we center marginalized folks.
Thank you for that, Jamarr. I wanted to pick up on something that you said, which is how are we leveraging relationships with elected officials? This actually came up in one of the chat questions as well. Someone asked, what is most helpful to ask a local government leader and employee in the event of a contested election? As we all know, the action will be taking place on a very localized level. That's where we ultimately will have the most power to do something. So what would you say to this person who works with local government leaders and employees? What should they ask these leaders?
One of the things, if I can jump in, Wing, is that's important. And one of the things, I serve, for example, on the Human Rights Commission for where I live in Austin, Texas. One of the things that we work with is that we do a lot of resolutions to our city council members. One of the things that we can do is to ask police departments to not respond in a violent way. We know that that has happened across the country. We saw that with George Floyd across earlier this summer, with Breonna Taylor, for example, recently last week. One of the very clear things you can do is ask that, yes, police have to be there to protect folks, right? But that we're not placing property over people in this situation. And so ask your police department or ask your elected officials to ask your police departments, right? Looking at their process of how they respond to protesters. Right, that they're not adding additional violence to those protesters that are coming to just simply say, the Constitution says that I have a right to vote and I'm showing up for that, but I'm also showing up to protect that right and to make sure that my vote is counted, and that nuances will not permit that. And so one of the things I think that folks can do is be very intentional in the conversations that they have with local elected officials around local law enforcement and police agencies of how they even respond to the protesters when they do show up. Because when we need folks to show up for these various actions that we put on, we want to make sure that they also are able to go home to their families. They're able to survive to the next day, to continue doing work in their communities.
Thank you so much for that. Panelists, anyone have anything to add to this? If not, we'll move into the next question. Okay, so third question for you all. We have a group of nearly 500 nonprofit leaders, organizers, and activists on this Zoom webinar right now. Many of these folks have a direct line to voters, to community members, and in some cases to elected officials. Within all of these spheres of influence, what is one word of advice that you have for how we best prepare for this election and beyond? And for this one, we would love to hear from each of the panelists, starting with Kifah.
Thanks, Wing. So in one word, I would say focus. A mentor of mine always reminds me to do that, and I think it's something I've been holding throughout this year especially. I think each of us has a role to play, especially in the scenarios that we outlined, and of course in the ones that we haven't. So I actually really recommend everybody does the activity that we put into the guide that we adapted from the Management Center, and look at your own spheres of influence personally and organizationally, and then really act accordingly, bring people in. And also, as a reminder, and something that we've been saying is that this guide is not just for organizers, it's for your apolitical neighbors, your family, your friends, and folks who genuinely would not want to see any of these scenarios play out. And so my, hope is that we can focus and continue to move forward and also bring more and more people in as we do.
Thank you. And next then we'll hear from Hardy.
Great, thanks. Adding to what Kifah said, I would say the word plan. The scenarios are laid out partly to create conversations between people. So as you think about your nonprofit, as apolitical as it may be, or as political as it may be, to actually raise what would we do in our community if this happened? What would it look like in our community? Perhaps we would really see manifestations very close by, or perhaps we're in a community where where we have a lot of confidence that the election would be administered in a certain way, but we would watch it happening elsewhere. What could we do? And beginning that conversation is not necessarily going to yield all the answers. None of us by ourselves can solve all of it. No one organization has all the answers. But I do believe we can all do something. And it starts with having those conversations and making it real. Like, these are some real scenarios. We've seen enough to know that we need some kind of insurance policy. There's not enough confidence right now that things are just going to go okay. So if there's a 20% chance or a 50% chance or a 70% chance that things aren't going to go okay, we need to prepare. And the last piece of that preparing is to think carefully about what political and non-political means to you. Because if an election is going to be subverted, if that's going to happen, and try to be clear, what are the indicators that would happen? Okay, if it starts going to that side of the line, then what is political and what is not political anymore? It's a fundamental issue of upholding our Constitution. It's important to have those conversations, probably actually now, rather than waiting.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Hardy. Next, Ankur.
Yeah, the word that really comes to mind for me is resilience. And thinking about, we have this plan, and yet at the same time, it's going to require each of us to be resilient ourselves and help others be resilient as well. I just saw a really great comment in the chat from someone who said, I'm an HR person for a nonprofit, and I think a lot about how to emotionally support my team pre and post election. I think that's a great example of doing what we can in our roles, whether it's in organizations or as community members, to help the people around us really be able to get through the next couple of months, which we know, will continue to be difficult. And so, yeah, I think really thinking about resilience and bringing that into the people, the spaces that we're in.
Yeah, and again, building back on what Hardy was saying to begin this, right? They're banking on us having a sense of defeatism and inevitability. And how do we counter that? Building resilience, right? Building networks of resilience with each other, building solidarity with each other. Marium.
Yeah, I think one word I'd probably share is bold. I spend a lot of time talking to volunteers, especially the past couple of weeks, encouraging them to get out the vote and build teams. And one of the things that has worked so well in motivating people is just reminding them that they can set the stage here and that they have the power to really tell the story, and just reminding them that them and their community united is really what's going to make the difference. And so being willing to be bold and different and really go against the narrative that we've been seeing spinning across the media and the past couple of years, being willing to be bold in that way, I think, is one thing that really speaks to me around this guide and what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Marium. And last but not least, Jamarr.
One of the things I think about is that all of everything what the other folks have said, but I think about knowledgeable and being knowledgeable in this election and being knowledgeable about what's on the ballot, what's on the line for yourself, for your community, for your friends. I think about being knowledgeable about how we share resources, whether that be election protection hotlines or et cetera. But one of the things I think that's important is really being knowledgeable about how important this election is. And as Ankur said, is about being resilient. The president stood on stage last night and already started to call the election a fraud. That challenges how we even participate in the election, right? Or how folks in our communities are even going to participate in the election. And so we've got to empower all of the great folks in our communities that we want to go vote about how they can protect themselves when they do. If they have an issue that arises, here are the organizations, here are the numbers that you can call, so that we can begin challenging voter intimidation and voter suppression. And so as much as we can give people tools and knowledge and resources, the better off we're going to be, even in any of the scenarios that may happen in this election. And so being knowledgeable about why you're voting, but being knowledgeable about all the rules so that you're able to protect yourself when you do show up to the polls.
That was great, thank you. I feel like all of those together really creates a comprehensive sense of where do we go from here? What do we do now? So with that, we would love to hear from our audience. I know that the chat has been popping off with a lot of questions. And so let me see. All right. One question that has kept popping up is, how are we getting the word out about this guide, the Hold the Line guide? Who are we, what organizations are we partnering with to amplify, to get out the word? And lastly, how are we also working with Black Lives Matter groups and organizers while we're doing this? Authors of the guide, I'll start with you all, Marium, Kifah, Ankur, or Hardy.
Yeah, I mean, I can start off, but this has really been a collective effort. I think, as Marium mentioned, we kind of came together a few months ago and really focused on putting this guide together. But in terms of distribution, there's a couple different avenues. So one is on social media. We're going to share our social media handles, I think, at the end of this and after as well, so you all can connect there. And then really we're part of a number of growing coalitions. There's a couple in particular. Protect the Results is one, Choose Democracy is another, working with organizations like Power now as well, to really start to not only build awareness about what might happen, but also start to get in the hands of folks who are actually organizing on the ground, because ultimately that's where this needs to be put into action. So I don't know, Marium or Kifah or Hardy, if you want to speak to any other ways we're distributing this.
I just wanted to add that, it's still currently being distributed. We still want to share it with as many folks as possible. So we do have a website, we do have social media, but we also very much so want to continue building relationships. And so if you know that there's folks that we haven't reached out to, we are very open to continue to have these conversations and trainings. We're also setting that up. And there's also a lot of other folks who are doing similar work that we mentioned, like Choose Democracy. So one thing that I just want to uplift is that if you know that we're not working with some folks that we should be working with, let us know and we will.
Yeah, and just to add one last note on that, we did create this guide and we are trying to distribute it as much as we can, but it is only possible with the support of everyone else in this movement as well. So most of the ways that we've actually gotten to reach most people is through people retweeting and really sharing it with their people, nonprofits sharing it on their listservs, and people really expanding it that way. At the end of the day, we can only share it to the small networks that we have, but you all have the capability to really share it with the very powerful, strong bases that you all also have. And not just share the guide, but also adopt it and really make it work for your programs, make it work for your base, make it work for your people. So I just wanted to add that as well. And then I also just really want to echo what Kifah said in terms of if there are particular organizations that need to be very explicitly in these conversations, please let us know. We are also going to be having 2 trainings actually, next Tuesday and the Tuesday after that, October 6th and October 13th, 7:30 p.m. Eastern time. And so that's another way that we're trying to distribute the idea. So it's not just a matter of distributing the guide, it is really a matter of distributing the theory of change, distributing the steps, and making sure that all of just frankly the ideas get spread across the country. So yeah.
Right, thank you for that. probably have time for one more question. So another question that kept coming up from a lot of different people is folks feeling a sense of uselessness, although I would not use that word, but feeling a sense of uselessness about living in a non-swing state, living in a blue state. What can those of us who live in blue states, what can we do to best support people, especially where voting might be most dangerous? So for this question, maybe we'll start with either Hardy or Jamarr.
I mean, I'll share something. I think, you know, when we start the planning process, we don't always know where we're going to end up. We have to map our assets within our communities. We have to figure out where the potential points of leverage are. So if you gather with people in your community to start an election protection team, just to start that conversation, and you have great confidence that the election will be administered well in your state and that that's not a concern. Nonetheless, your state is connected to other states, particularly economically. So, you know, as someone, for example, from Massachusetts, there are many corporations in Massachusetts. I'm not in Massachusetts now, I'm in the DC area, but growing up in Massachusetts, there are many corporations there who may have all kinds of links that I don't even know about. Are they going to be fence sitters if actions are taken to subvert our democracy? If this corporation is going to stand aside and just say, we don't know, we're not political? Or is it our job now to figure out which ones could really have leverage if they took a position and start to push that on them, like now? Like get the media attention on them now. Have that conversation start within their C-suite executive level or board now. And so the thing about holding the line is that unless we draw it and make it clear, the line keeps getting pushed back. It keeps shifting. We need to draw it and hold it. And there are plenty of groups that aren't doing that for whatever reason. But we can tell corporations that. And so that's just one point of leverage, but there may be others in your community.
One of the things I'll add, Wayne, to what Hardy mentioned is, one of the things is a lot of states have different organizations, whether they be nonprofit or political organizations. If you have the ability to volunteer for some of those organizations. So I live in Texas, right? For example, we have a hotline where voters can call, and you don't necessarily have to be a trained attorney to work that line. I know some of my friends who have just called, and when folks call in, they help direct people where they can go. They help people get directed to their polling locations. And so research some of those organizations in other states that you may be interested in, because I want folks to also be respectful to the communities that exist already in those states, right? And be able to add capacity and add leverage to make sure that we're protecting the elections in those respective states and that they're able to participate also as well. And so some of that research will happen, some of those connections will happen. If you have the economic means to donate, those organizations are always raising money. You know, they're C3 nonprofit organizations that literally do work around election protection. If you're able to donate to those folks, fundraise for those folks so that they have the resources to pay lawyers and other election officials, et cetera, to be able to do some of that work. And so those are things that you all can do that if you don't live in a state that you feel may be marginalized, that you can do in your state. But I will also make a point is that even in the blue states, there are still stipulations in those states. And so there's still election protection work to happen in those states. And so we also don't want to make the assumption that blue states are just going to continue to go blue, or that there are not going to be issues that come up in blue states. And so it's a balancing act of ensuring that, yes, those states that you work in and that you live in are doing what they're supposed to do, but also leveraging that to be supportive to the other states, but also respecting those communities and those organizations that are on the ground doing that work and adding leverage to capacity. And so I'll add that to what Hardy already outlined.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Can I add one other thing? And I want to, Jamarr, everything Jamarr said, and one other point when I talked about getting the executive levels to think about this is that the executive levels may not take a position, then talk to the workers, because there's power there too, right? If we're consistent with our civil resistance model of change, the workers have enormous power. And so if higher ups don't draw the line, perhaps workers will. Thanks.
One thing that I just want to add to that, if I can, Wing, is that because we're in a COVID-19 era, a lot of campaigns have moved their work online. So that just inherently means that all of us can actually get involved in any state's fight. So, you don't have to be based in California to do phone banking for Ohio. You can do that remotely from where you're at. And I think the most important thing about what Hardy and Jamarr are mentioning, and also to point out that there's a lot of digital ways that you can now plug in and really fight the fight, is that you just need to stay at the ready, right? I think that what's really important is that none of us can actually take a back seat right now. All of us need to be prepared, whether it's because you've been really involved in your mutual aid efforts, whether you've been really involved in the movement for Black lives, however you've been taking action this year, continue to do so, because we just need to be prepared, and continuously staying engaged in that way will allow us to be.
Could I add one more thing? So actually, this is a question that my aunt actually asked me. She lives in Berkeley. Y'all know that's where all everything starts, kind of. And one other thing that I would just add that folks haven't covered yet is really setting up the stage for nonviolent civil resistance. Mass nonviolent resistance is gonna actually start now. It's not gonna happen on November, post November 3rd, where everyone has a knee-jerk reaction, is trying to figure out what the response is. Jamarr mentioned getting commitments from armed agents is important. Getting commitments from already Democrat representatives is important. Getting all of that ready way before to prepare for nonviolent resistance is what we all need to be doing right now. So if you live in those areas, you still have a lot of work to do. We got to be ready to act in this way, to really enact this theory of change that we're talking about, to really stop Trump from essentially stealing the election. So yeah.
Thank you all so much for that. And one of the other questions, which we don't have time for right now, comes from groups that work internationally, asking, well, what can we do? We're not based in the US, or people who we serve are not based in the US. And I actually think that what the panelists have just shared does get at that somewhat, right? Which is, a lot of the action taken right now is digital. Can you find ways to support something that is happening digitally? Can you find ways to amplify something that is already going on? So I know that we are getting short on time. So with that, I'm going to thank all of our panelists so much for all of your thoughtful, insightful comments, and I will pass it back to Marc.
All right, thank you so much. So I want to just acknowledge that a lot of folks on this call come from the nonprofit world. And I want to take the last few minutes to walk you through some of the tools that we put together to drive organizational planning and decision-making around these scenarios. I am a lifelong nonprofit person. I do not believe that we can nonprofit our way out of this mess. But civil society will have a crucial role to play in any of these scenarios. And that's especially true even of non-political nonprofits. Protecting democracy is not a partisan issue. And chances are that US laws and policies impact your nonprofit's mission pretty deeply. And if that's true, there is a way to show your supporters why your mission depends on a functioning democracy. I think we really have to normalize this protest. We need to make nonviolent resistance something that everyone is doing, not just progressives. The more non-progressive groups get involved, the more this will be lifted up. So I hope everyone here will think about how this plays out at your own nonprofit, and how you drive organizational conversations. And since this is an extraordinarily busy time, we've tried to make it as easy for you as possible. So we are going to be sharing the slides that we presented today. Every slide you've seen today will be shared. And I want to walk you through some of the other slides that we have ready for you in the deck to help with your planning. So we have the summary slide and all the detailed slides that the authors already went through. And then we have some key questions that really can serve as a sample agenda for organizational planning. I think it's really important to make the point internally for others who haven't sort of gone through this process of basing themselves in the research and thinking about how these scenarios will play out in the streets, that the overwhelming evidence has shown that coordinated nonviolent mass action is the most effective tactic. That is something that people at a lot of organizations who are thinking about their response may not know and haven't processed yet. We also need to recognize that they're going to be taking up a lot of the oxygen. This is going to be all that's happening if it happens. So what tools do we have at our disposal to support this organizationally? How do we think about our organizational comfort zone and what happens to that comfort zone in an unprecedented scenario where fundamental democratic norms are being subverted? Critically, how do we make sure that organizationally we are putting the needs and safety of the most vulnerable first? I've laid out here some of the ways in which communities of color, this is only a few of the ways communities of color are going to be on the front lines of this. So how do we make sure that we are rooting everything we do organizationally in the knowledge of and monitoring of what those groups are saying they need on the ground? And how can you prepare organizational leadership, in your department? How do you ladder up to board members and ED level and C-suite level folks for this situation? And then also organizationally, you're going to want to think through how this impacts your day-to-day work. How are you staffing for this? What is it going to do to fundraising? What is it going to do to your budgeting? These are all important conversations to start now. And, God willing, we don't have to enter in these scenarios, and this was a wasted conversation. That'd be great. A couple other things that are in this deck. We've got a couple uncontested scenarios just to make sure that your organization is planning for those, a decisive Trump or Biden win. And then there's a special section on what this might mean for fundraising with some key questions there. So we will be sharing this in this slide deck, every slide you've seen so far, and an email tomorrow to everyone who registered for the Zoom call. If you didn't register, or you're joining us on Facebook or after the fact, if you sign up at bit.ly MR Lab sign up, you can get that. If it's after tomorrow, October 1st, you can email defend@holdthelineguide.org or check out holdthelineguide.com. There are a bunch of trainings that you're going to see here, additional trainings. There are tons of questions that we didn't get to answer here. So that'll be a good place to continue diving into this. Some of those trainings are still being finalized, so check back at Hold the Line Guide to sign up. And of course, really the most powerful tool today is the guide itself. So please, it's written for anyone to read. Please share it with everyone at holdthelineguide.com. So with 1 minute left, I'd like to do one final reflection here. Everyone occupies different spheres of influence, from friends and family to your organizations and movements that you're part of. So within your spheres of influence, I want folks to think about, before you drop off and share in the chat, what is one thing that I can commit to doing tomorrow to start planning for a contested election? So take a moment to think, pop your response in the chat. I'll pull back up the questions in the sample agenda so you can look at those. And thank you so much to our panelists and moderator today, Doan, Jamarr Brown from Repower, Kifah, Shah, Marium, Navid, Ankur, Asthana, and Merriman, the authors of the guide. And I've just learned that the guide authors are going to be able to stay on for about 10 minutes in a virtual, come up to the podium kind of thing that you might have if we were on in person. So whoever wants to stay on can. We'll try to answer some more of the amazing questions that we got in the chat. We will share the resources shared in the chat as well. And thank you all so much. All right, I see a lot of folks adding to the chat. We've had an amazing conversation here today. So anybody who wants to stay on, we will, the panelists will still continue answering questions from the chat. So take it away, panelists.
Okay, I can help maybe direct us here a little bit just based on some of the questions I see popping up. From Christine Green. Should we ask politicians to sign a pledge or just make some kind of public statement? And what forms are acceptable? Social media or a written proclamation? I see Marium and then Hardy. Go for it. Go for it, Marium.
Thank you again, Wing, by the way, for facilitating. The answer is yes. So we definitely encourage everyone to really ask for public commitments from all of the power players in your area. In the guide, we have like a breakdown of how you can identify the power players. And then the next step after that is to really get that public commitment from them that they're really going to commit to election integrity and essentially protect the election and keep things nonviolent. I'm so glad you asked this question. We are actually in the process of creating a campaign right now, a public commitments campaign. I'm forgetting the name right now. I'm sure Hardy can remember. But we're going to be releasing this hopefully either by the end of this week or next week. And we've got things outlined where there's some potential like drafts of commitments that you can send to different power players. And it's something that you can totally adapt. Do you want to add anything, Hardy, Kifah, Ankur?
You said it. I'm glad the question was asked. The tentative title for the campaign is The Commitment to Defend Democracy, though all things are still in the discussion mode, but we anticipate that we will be launching the campaign next week. And so follow us on Twitter, check our website. We want to move ahead quickly. Time is short.
Thank you all. So another question that has just popped up from Benjamin Abrams. There are a lot of groups and people who have been engaged in anti-Trump resistance or just resistance, generally speaking, for a long time. Do you plan to bring them in on this, or do you see that as something separate? And I will say the guide, as it was written, was formulated sort of using the Indivisible guide that came out post 2016 election as a model, right? And so I think in that sense, there is sort of this ongoing legacy or tradition of passing on what has worked from Indivisible and from the resistance movement and taking that into this. But perhaps authors of the guide, Ankur, Kifah, do you want to address this question?
Yeah, I can start off. I think one thing that we recognized with this guide in particular is that the time is so short that, as much as the four of us plus, partners we know can do to get it out there, it won't be nearly enough if this really doesn't take off and other people take it and make it their own. And so I would just say that, yeah, we're doing what we can to try to bring in as many groups as possible and share this and partner where we can. But really, it's up to everyone who's on this webinar and who reads this guide to share it out and bring in people to this.
Yeah, thanks, Ankur. So one thing that I think when we consider our spheres of influence is to also we're not saying just start your own thing without any consideration for what's around you. I never recommend that as an organizer. You need to, the reason why we have a power mapping activity in the guide is because once you start to really think about the lay of the land and the landscape of where you're at as a local person, you really start to understand, wow, there's X organization that's doing this work and then there's Y that's doing that. Maybe I should go join their efforts, bring in this guide, have these conversations here, and there's already this group of folks that's, activated to plug in with. I really want to just drive home the idea that there's probably a lot of work happening around you, and you should certainly enter it with humility and also with this information. And then also understand that, yes, as things are moving very quickly, people are going to have a lot to offer. And you personally, especially if you're an everyday person who's not already within movement spaces, can offer time, energy, and money, and so many other things that, are really depleted right now in a lot of spaces. And so I'd say, take this guide as just a starting point and then build from there, considering all of the things that are going on immediately around you.
If I can add to that, one of the things I think that's important, again, I agree about not reinventing the wheel, right? But also I think one of the things to consider as part of the power mapping that's in the guide and, even what we teach at Repower is there's organizations that are doing different buckets of the work, right? So when we're thinking about this cross collaboration, right, there are folks that do digital work very well, considering we're in a pandemic, right? There are folks that do election work very well. There are folks that do legal work. There are folks that have large memberships that can mobilize people pretty quickly. There are folks that have strong relationships with elected officials, right? When we're making some of these asks for commitments to democracy and protection and public safety of folks. And so also be thinking of how can you build coalitions in your community of organizations that are not just reflective of resources and skills, but also reflective of different communities of people.
Thank you. All right, we might only have time for this one last question. So a couple of different people have chatted, you know, going back to, I think, Hardy, you had said, calling on the military, asking the military to remember who they serve, right? Well, in the moment that we're in right now, where there has been so much violence inflicted upon people, protesters, by the police, by the military, how do we balance that, right? How do we, and I guess a part of that question is who should be building that relationship? Who should be making that ask? Hardy, since it came up in yours, do you want to start and then we can open it up?
Sure. So one of the most powerful things that happens abroad when I look at democratic transitions are defections from groups that you wouldn't think would defect. Groups that seemed loyal before, and suddenly when real pressure comes on, they start to divide, crack, and then they sort of cascade. In fact, it's incredibly common when you have a democratic transition to have defections, and sometimes those defections are from security forces. And it is not easy, obviously. But a core of this process is sometimes getting out of looking at big institutions and trying to break them down and say, okay, where are the differentials of loyalty and interest within this institution? It's not actually completely a monolith. It may function like a monolith, but when under pressure, people are going to start behaving different ways. And looking, and it's very challenging, especially when someone's in uniform, to know what they're feeling. They literally all look the same. That's by design. They're supposed to look uniform. And yet we know, having heard police after they've defected under an autocrat talk about what their thought process was, all the trade-offs they were making. I wanted to do something, but then I realized my children may be in that crowd. Or I realized that, you know, after repeated appeals, I really was doing nothing other than being used to enrich someone who was stealing from the country. And I just couldn't accept the fact that I was no longer serving the Constitution. Now, that's not going to be true with everyone. And it's I think there's different bridges to those folks, and there's different ways to make contact. And it's obviously work that is sensitive and work that I respect anyone's views about whether they're suited for that work or want to do that work or not. Sometimes veterans or retired people are good intermediaries. Sometimes just people in the community, sometimes clergy, it depends. And sometimes just ordinary people who say, I want a meeting, or I'm gonna be in front and you can see me and I'm gonna do it and make that call. So it's gonna be different in different places. The point is that how the police respond is going to be important. So to the extent that we can try to get ahead of that and set the tone a little bit, that can also be helpful.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We still have about 100 people on, but I want to be respectful that our amazing panelists gave us 10 more minutes. Thank you, Uyen, so much for moderating. Thank you, Marium, Kifah, Ankur, Hardy, Jamarr, and for all the folks at M&R who made the nuts and bolts of this happen. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate your participation. We'll share all the materials right after this, and good luck.